Hello, and welcome to video number 17, Introduction to Capital Cost Management and Federal Requirements, which is in the online course for managing operational and capital costs at rural and small urban transit systems. This video's contents are from Module E of the full guidebook on managing system costs and is the 11th video in the direct operation route in the extra credit track. This video may be useful to you if you need an overview of the types of capital costs and how to estimate capital costs, or are new to the concept of transit asset management. In one sentence, Module E provides you with strategies for managing capital costs. Module E contains 3 chapters, and this video's contents are from Chapter 14, Capital Cost Management and Federal Requirements. Okay, let's get started. Chapter 14 covers these topics: an overview of capital expenses, capital cost estimation and management, capital improvement plans, and transit asset management. By the end of this video, you should be able to describe categories of capital cost expenditures, identify major components of a capital improvement plan, discuss upper-level strategies for managing capital costs, discuss the importance of transit asset management, or TAM, and outline federal requirements under the TAM rule. We'll start by discussing an overview of the different types of capital expenses. Capital investments are one of the cornerstones of enhancing and maintaining a level of service, any level of service at any transit system. And capital investments include a wide range of different types of one-time expenditures on physical assets. These can include things like office buildings or stations, terminals, equipment, perhaps for maintaining vehicles, the vehicles themselves, buying right-of-way, etc. In fact, between fiscal years 2017 and 2019, the most significant capital cost driver for Texas rural and small urban transit systems was revenue vehicles, and accounted for 69% of capital costs across all 3 fiscal years, which is not a surprise, and vehicles continues to be a significant driver of costs for any transit system. Chapter 14, which is the basis of this particular video, will provide you with basic capital cost management strategies for all asset types. And if you want more information on managing the capital costs of vehicles, then you can go to the next video, which is based on Chapter 15. Let's talk a little bit about the capital asset life cycle. Every capital asset really begins with identifying the need. This is needs identification, the process of determining what capital assets are needed, how many, and that's usually based on your level of service or on your current assets, in order to figure out when they need to be rehabilitated or replaced. Once you identify the needs, then you can begin the planning process, taking those needs and put them into a plan that lays out the costs of those needs, of those capital assets, the sources of revenue you're going to use to pay for those assets, when that's going to happen, any sort of timeline or phasing, so that you know when you're going to acquire and or build whatever capital asset. Obviously, then the acquisition or construction phase begins for your capital asset. You use that asset, and at a certain point in that asset's life, it will need to be replaced or retired or rehabilitated in some significant way, again, depending on what type of capital asset we're talking about. So what are some of the drivers of capital costs? What makes capital costs fluctuate? So it's very important to understand and think about what is actually included in capital costs. And it's important to have an agency-wide capital cost categorization schema, some way that you think about and organize your capital costs. Now, the USOA, or Uniform System of Accounts, uses 2 main categories for capital costs. And although rural systems usually do not have to categorize their capital expenses into the USOA categories because they don't have to report them that way, this is a very good framework to think about capital costs. The 2 categories in the USOA basically can be boiled down to existing service or expanding service. And you can see the first bullet point here is rehabilitation, reconstruction, replacement, and improvement of existing service. So this would be any sort of expenditure, any sort of capital expenditure, where you're trying to rehabilitate, improve, replace capital assets to support your existing service. Now, if you're trying to build a new route, may a new BRT line, or are buying new buses to expand your service, for instance, that is an expansion of service capital cost. The USOA also groups assets into 9 different types. If you're looking at the USOA, these will appear as object classes. And those are guideway, passenger stations, administrative buildings, maintenance buildings, revenue vehicles, service vehicles, fare collection equipment, communication and information systems, and basically everything else. Right, so the USOA provides this framework for us so we can think about how to categorize and organize our capital costs. Now that you know how to categorize your capital costs, the next step is figuring out how we can estimate and then manage those costs. So cost estimation is a critical step in making a capital plan, right? Estimating costs accurately is both important and very difficult. If you can estimate your capital costs accurately, you can avoid budgetary problems and maintain public and stakeholder trust in your project, whatever it is. And this can be challenging because of the volatility of capital costs and any sort of anticipated project returns. Again, the idea of project returns is more salient when you're talking about big facility projects or something like that. But even buying vehicles, right, you expect a certain life out of them and or a certain life cycle cost. And that can be very difficult to predict, especially because of supply chain challenges, which is definitely true in our current age in the post-pandemic world. And just changing market conditions can have effects on the cost of a capital asset, both now and in the future. So when you're looking at capital expenses and trying to estimate the cost of a capital project, whatever you're buying or building, it's important to estimate what those costs may be. And that estimation process needs to take into account the procurement strategy you're planning to use, any training or consulting costs that might be associated with the acquisition of that asset or facility, any sort of maintenance cost that's going to occur not only upfront but over the long term. Is there any other investments that need to be made in order to support that capital asset? An example of this, of course, is buying an electric bus or electric vehicle of some kind. There's related infrastructure like chargers and other grid improvements that might be necessary in order to have that electric vehicle. Understanding what the useful service life is critical, and at the end of that asset's life, what is its salvage value, right? So all of these things need to be thought about as you're planning for your capital expenses. And in the end, you want to try to select the option, right? The asset, the way of procurement, etc., that will give you your highest return on your investment, or if you're thinking of in transit terms, sort of, the best value for your dollar. And when you're thinking of this, it's important to also take into account the time value of money and if there's going to be any sort of interest rates and things like that on a loan that you might need to take out. Let's talk a bit about the cost pressures on capital projects. With any capital project, it's important to expect from the very outset to encounter continuous pressures toward increasing costs. This is very common in any sort of project to begin with, and especially in capital projects. There are 2 main kinds of misestimations we want to talk about. The first is the cost overrun, and this is when there's an increase in the capital cost above an initial estimate, which is caused by factors that are unrelated to the economy, right? Not caused by economic factors, but usually caused by poor cost estimation at the beginning or expansions in the project's scope and even poor cost control procedures. And this is extremely common in transit projects. In fact, previous studies have cited that 45% or so of US rail transit projects end up experiencing some kind of cost overrun. So it's very important to try to avoid this pressure. Now, sometimes the cost increase is actually caused by factors related to the economy, and this we would just call cost escalation. Now, this is beyond an agency's control in reality, and the major driver is when there's above average inflation in the general economy, and that spills over to many different ways to the capital project or the purchasing of the asset. So, when there's high market demand and low supply in different cost categories, that can cause cost escalation. So how do you avoid going over budget in your capital project? So one way is to have a transparent, structured process for estimating your capital costs. That way, different people can see exactly how capital costs were estimated, and you're being very strategic about how you do that. That can help prevent overruns. Spend the time you need and the resources you need to clearly define the project scope. What actually are we going to do in this capital project? What are we going to buy? What are we going to build? And delineate those boundaries as clearly as possible up front and build that into your cost estimation procedure. Obtain as much of the capital cost detail as you can very early on in the planning stage of any sort of capital project. You really want to understand how much will things cost at the time that I'm going to have to spend this money, and are there factors that I need to be keeping in mind. It's good to have your cost estimate reviewed by independent consultants, and in some cases, an independent cost estimate may be required. Another thing to do is compare the cost of your capital project with other recently completed similar projects. This can give you an idea if your cost estimate is close to what actually happened in reality for real projects. Do a peer review of cost estimates of similar projects and try to identify the risks, right, of your project on the capital side and set aside some contingency funds in the budget, expecting that unexpected things are going to happen. You can look at historical price fluctuations. Of course, that can help you understand how much the risk is of a cost overrun. Don't just look at average inflation rates and assume that every year, if inflation seems to be 2 to 3%, for instance, well, that's just a good enough number to estimate the capital cost. Look actually at what is in your market basket of what you're going to buy in the capital project. See what those historical price fluctuations are, and take those into account when you are building your budget for a capital project. All right, next let's talk about capital improvement plans. What is a capital improvement plan, or CIP? It's really the primary instrument the transit agency has for planning, estimating, and controlling its capital expenditures. It's made up of two aspects. The first is an analysis of each specific potential capital project that an agency plans to do, and then ultimately packaging all of those different analyses up and selecting the projects that an agency plans to do and putting them into a 20-year capital plan, which is a typical capital plan is on a 20-year horizon. Some can be a little bit shorter or even a little bit longer. A CIP usually includes information about the ongoing management of your current capital assets, and also provides that sort of overview of, okay, what are the major funding sources and costs for all projects that are in the plan. The CIP should contain all of those selected project capital plans. So you have a document in which all of the selected capital projects over the next 20 years, how much they're going to cost, and where the money is going to come from. Now, a capital plan for a specific project should describe in detail several things. First, what are going to be the methods that we're going to use to acquire or construct any sort of asset? What are the estimated life cycle costs of that asset? So we understand not only the upfront capital costs, but also any life cycle capital costs and any operational costs associated with that asset if it's going to introduce new operational costs. What is the timeline for acquisition of the asset? And of course, where's the money going to come from to pay for it? Now, the level of detail in each project capital plan can be continuously refined and updated, with there being more precision and more detail as the capital project moves closer to implementation. Any sort of project capital plan definitely needs that funding source analysis. Where is the money going to come from? Who's paying for this? And how do we get to that number? And particularly if you're counting on competitive grants, for instance, from the FTA or from the state, in order to fund your capital project, make sure that you've identified the criticality of that particular funding source, how much it is unknown, and if you're able to identify alternative funding sources for that capital project, it's good to put that in the plan that, if we don't win X grant, then, we're going to be trying to seek this other funding source. It's important also to not tie together or to do necessarily at the same time funding or budgets and cost estimation. One of the worst ways to approach a capital improvement plan and a project capital plan is to try to say, well, I'm going to have this much money available And so that's how much this project is going to cost. That is not a realistic way to create a capital project plan. And really, the cost estimate needs to be done. That's the core thing. And then we understand how we think we're going to fund it. And you might not be able to fund the project with known resources, and that just demonstrates the need that you have to identify more resources for funding. So we talked a lot about plans and capital improvement plans, and those are typical for transit systems, especially the larger you get. But one thing that's needed for any transit system is a transit asset management plan, or a TAM plan. So let's talk about TAM here. So transit asset management is a rule. It's published by the FTA in 2016, and it applies to anyone listening to these videos. Likely, if you receive any Chapter 53 funds, and that's 5311, 5307, 5310, etc., and you own, operate, or manage capital assets used in providing public transportation services. So any transit agency, anybody who's providing public transportation. Now, what exactly you have to do under the TAM requirements depends on the size of your organization and what type of operation you have. There's two tiers called Tier 1 and Tier 2, and we'll get into those later. But generally speaking, regardless of what tier you're in, an agency has to develop a TAM plan and has to submit TAM reports to the National Transit Database, or NTD. Depending on the type of agency you are, you can submit your own TAM plan to the FTA, or you might participate in a group plan, which is typically done under a state DOT, or if you're part of a region where maybe several transit agencies are cooperating with an MPO or something like that, that also could be a group TAM plan. Now, as we previously mentioned, there are two different tiers under the TAM rule, Tier 1 or Tier 2. So let's start with the Tier 1 side. You're a Tier 1 agency if you operate rail. That's default setting. And if you operate 100 or more peak vehicles across all fixed route modes, or you operate 101 or more peak vehicles in one non-fixed route mode, you may be Tier 1. On the Tier 2 side, any subrecipient of 5311 funds, if that's the only kind of funding you receive, then you are a Tier 2 subrecipient. It doesn't matter what size of agency you are. Or if you're an American Indian tribe, then you are automatically Tier 2. If you don't meet those two qualifications, you may still be Tier 2 if you operate 100 or fewer peak vehicles across all fixed route modes, or you operate 100 or fewer peak vehicles in one non-fixed route mode. Now, there's a lot of ors on the screen, and it sort of can be hard to go, well, where do I really fit in? The FTA has provided a decision-making tree, or as they call it, a workflow, on helping you decide whether you're a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 agency, and that can be found on the FTA's website. And you can just Google FTA TAM tier checklist, or am I a Tier 1 or Tier 2 agencies? Search for that, and you will find that checklist. Also, the link is displayed on the screen at this time. Now, so we talked about the two different types of agencies, and every agency has to develop a TAM, or Transit Asset Management Plan. Now, a Tier 1 plan is slightly different than a Tier 2 plan because most of the viewers of this video are Tier 2 agencies. We're going to focus our attention on that. A Tier 2 plan must contain an inventory of capital assets, an asset condition assessment, decision support tools, and investment prioritization. Now, the condition of assets relies on FTA-defined performance measures in 4 different categories. So there needs to be an assessment of your rolling stock, your equipment, your facilities, and any infrastructure. Now, the overall goal of a TAM plan, right, is to be able to identify what are my capital assets and what then are the needs to maintain or replace those assets, report those needs and how I'm doing in terms of those assets to the NTD, ultimately helping me to create an investment schedule, not only for my agency, but also this helps to communicate up to the FTA the level of needs throughout all of the public transportation providers in the U.S. So let's pause real quick for a couple review questions. First, what is a capital improvement plan? I'll pause the video and I'll be back with the answer. A capital improvement plan is the primary instrument for planning, estimating, and controlling your capital expenditures. It's usually about 20 years long, but give or take a few years depending on your agency preferences. And it includes the project-specific analyses for every capital project, and for each of those, the cost and funding for all of them. Here's another question. What is one strategy for helping reduce the likelihood of underestimating the cost of a capital asset or a project? We named several, so you can name any one. Pause the video and I'll be back with the answer. There's several different strategies you can apply when you are trying to help reduce the likelihood of underestimating your capital costs. One is maintaining adequate project control. Second, avoiding scope creep or changes in the project scope as the project goes along. 3, spend the time and the resources necessary to clearly define the scope of your capital project. 4, obtain as much detail as possible early in the planning stages of your project. 5, conduct peer reviews of cost estimates. 6, obtain cost estimates from independent consultants. And 7, don't forget to consider historical price fluctuations, not just average inflation rates. And there's a few others we mentioned, but those are some of the core ones. All right, here's another review question. How many tiers or different system size categories are there in the TAM rule? And in addition to that, what defines a Tier 1 system? Pause the video and I'll be back with the answer. Now there's 2 tiers under the TAM rule, Tier 1 and Tier 2. A Tier 1 system either operates rail, right? If they operate rail, you're automatically a Tier 1 system, or you operate 101 or more peak vehicles across all fixed route modes, or operate 101 or more peak vehicles in one non-fixed route mode. Remember that if the only funding you receive is as a subrecipient to your state DOT, you are by default a Tier 2 agency, no matter how many vehicles you operate. Also, if your agency is an American Indian tribe, then you are automatically under Tier 2 in the TAM rule. Okay, here are the key takeaways from this video. First, acquiring a capital asset comes with operational costs as well. So don't forget that when you're getting a capital asset and thinking about the costs, it's important to consider all costs associated with acquiring that asset. Second, it's important to start the process of cost estimation very early on when you're planning a capital project and try to account for cost escalation and carefully avoid cost overruns. Those are things you do not want to happen with your capital project. Third, implement your performance-based transit asset management, right? Complying with the federal requirements, and also integrate your project capital plans into an overall agency 20-year plan, what we call a CIP or capital improvement plan. Fourth, any transit agency receiving Chapter 53 funding is required to comply with the TAM rule. Additional information, resources, and references are provided in Chapter 14 of the guidebook, and we encourage you to check them out and watch the remaining videos of this online course. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, send them to the email address provided in the video description. Also, links to the full guidebook and toolkit are in the video description, which is where you can also find a link to a short online evaluation form for this specific video. Please fill out this form if this is the first time you've watched this video, because we use that data to help improve this course. If you want to continue in the direct operation route to learn more about managing vehicle capital costs, check out the next video, video number 18. If you want to watch another extra credit video, perhaps consider checking out video number 19, Managing Technology Costs.